All right, all right. Hey, if you wouldn't mind grabbing a seat. All right. Well, it is good to have you here tonight as we are continuing our series, Cannonball. We're talking about, what it is to live a kind of faith that kind of leaves a ripple effect, that leaves an impact on our community, and leaves an impact on the world around us. And tonight I want to kind of talk around this concept of generosity, and specifically this idea of sort of the importance of just adding water. And if that doesn't make any sense to you right now, I'm telling you, if you'll stick with me, it will. Because kind of my big point tonight is that you can't make a wave without water. You can't make a wave without water. You can't dive in. You can't do a cannonball. And some of you are like, see, this is why I come here, for deep theological concepts like that. Like, you can't make a wave without water. But again, stick with me. Hopefully by the end of this will make a little bit more sense to you in terms of its connection with generosity. And so to do this, over these next several weeks, again, we're talking about some wave makers. And tonight I want to talk about this wave maker by the name of Elijah. This wave maker by the name of Elijah. And we kind of read, at least the story we're going to kind of unpack tonight. We read about him in 1 Kings chapter 18. 1 Kings 18. And basically, when Elijah shows up on the scene, he shows up in a time of Israel. Now, Israel had kind of had a history of sort of being with this sort of on again, off again relationship with God. Like they had their seasons sometimes where, man, they'd be really passionate about God, and other seasons where they just kind of go adrift. And this is sort of one of these seasons. When we catch up to sort of the scene here in the nation of Israel, this is kind of one of those seasons where they're not really fully committed when it comes to God. It's not that they've abandoned their faith in God. It's just that they also have faith in a whole bunch of other little g gods. And part of that was because of Ahab's leadership at the time. Ahab at the time was sort of the ruler of Israel. And he didn't, maybe I would say, probably didn't marry real well. And the reason I say that is his wife was named Jezebel. And even if you don't know a whole lot about the Bible, you can recognize that Jezebel was not known for being the nicest of ladies. She was a Phoenician princess, and she really had it out for trying to basically import all of her little g gods, and specifically this god by the name of Baal, this little g god by the name of Baal, who Baal was, at the time, he was sort of considered the storm god, the rain god. In fact, the cool thing is, kind of through the amazing work of modern technology, archaeologists have actually found a picture of what Baal probably looked like. In fact, I think we get a picture of Baal here. Yes, yeah, who's like, oh yeah, like a weatherman. So, they considered Baal was in charge of all the weather, all the storms, all the rain. And by the way, that was significant because back then rain had significance on a spiritual sense. Rain was this connection with blessing, with provision, with abundance. It was a matter of life or death. And so this was a kind of a pretty big deal. And so Jezebel comes on the scene. She marries Ahab. And so again, they're sort of importing Baal, importing these little g gods, and all the while exporting, she's trying to export the big G God, Yahweh, out of the nation of Israel. And so, as you might figure, this didn't sit real well with God. As kind of open relationships in general just don't do real well relationally, and especially with a relationship with God. In fact, again, kind of cultural-wise, it's kind of like my boy. Whenever I watch sports with him, oftentimes I'll ask him, like, hey, who are you for? Are you for the Seahawks? Are you for the Cowboys? And he's like, I'm for both teams. Like, he wanted to play it safe. And again, that's kind of what we find here in this nation. They're trying to play it safe. They're trying to, have their cake and eat it too. And again, for God, this was, just the height of of frustration, the height of, this sense of this isn't sitting real well with them. Because again, faithfulness in this relationship with God is incredibly important. And so, this is the very first commandment. Love the Lord your God with all your heart. No other gods, and you should have no other gods besides me. And so God's response to this problem, so we got these, we got this nation of Israel that's kind of right in the fence, going back and forth between all these gods, and never really cannonballing, never really trusting fully in God. And so God's response to the problem is to raise up a person. And this is significant because, in fact, God's response to any problem on the earth is always people. Like when there's a problem, God's response, God's answer to those problems is to raise up a person. In fact, if you ever see a problem in the earth, but you don't see a person that's answering that problem, there might be a real good possibility that person, that's the answer to that problem is actually you. There's a reason. You ever know some people will be like, man, somebody should do something about that. Somebody should fix that. And you just want to go, well, maybe, just maybe that person is you. If God has put that burden, if God has put that passion, God has put that vision in your mind to see the issue, see the problem, there could very well be a very real likelihood that God is calling you to be the answer to that problem. And so in this case, in this problem, God chooses, again, this guy by the name of Elijah. And Elijah, we don't necessarily know a whole lot about up to this point. In fact, there's just a chapter before where he kind of rolls up on the scene, and we don't know a lot about Elijah outside of his appearance. Apparently, he was known for having a lot of hair. In fact, if Baal, again, through the power of modern technology, if Baal was like Al Roker, Elijah probably looked a little bit more like this. Take a look. He was like known for hair. In fact, actually, the interesting thing, you want to tell the difference whenever someone asks you, like, what's the difference between Elijah and Elisha? Well, Elijah was known for having a lot of hair. Elisha was known for having like no hair. And by the way, he was super sensitive about it. In fact, there was like a story where some kids were making fun of the fact that he didn't have he was going bald and didn't have much hair. And so he basically called on God to send a bear to maul the kids. I mean, you talk about super sensitive, right? But that's not that guy. We're talking about Chewbacca here. We're talking about Elijah. And so Elijah, he's raised up, and when we first see him, he just walks in. He kind of just makes this quick kind of a wedding crashing scene. He just shows up in the king's court, walks in one day, and basically says, hey, look, for too long, you guys have been riding the fence. You're saying you're a follower of God. You're saying you're committed. You're saying you're cannonballing into this thing, and you've surrendered it all to him, and yet you're going around worshiping all these lowercase g gods. And so as a result, I'm telling you, that blessing that you're longing for by pursuing these lowercase g gods, listen, he's turning off the faucet. You're going to go without rain until your hearts get turned. Until your hearts get turned back to God. And so he says this, walks in, makes this announcement, drops the mic and walks out. Doesn't say anything else. And you can just imagine like Ahab and they're like, whoa, okay, who is this guy? What is Chewbacca doing coming in and walking out? Like, what's the deal here? And so he walks out, and so sure enough, at first they don't think much about it, but then 4 or 5 months passes by and like the rain stopped. And drought's starting to come across the land, and they're starting to get a little frustrated, and they're starting to think, well, maybe there was something to this weatherman. And so they kind of send out search parties to try to track it down, Elijah, track down this weatherman, but it would actually end up being about 3 years by the time they actually find Elijah. 3 years he's going right. So 3 years, think about this, they're in drought. 3 years they go without rain. And as a result, it's leading to a desperate situation. In fact, in the early part of 1 Kings 18, it kind of speaks to just the pure desperation they're in. As it says that because the situation got so bad, they were so lacking in water, that they were literally having debates about whether the horses or the cows should live. I mean, this was a bad situation. I mean, this was a major crisis. They had no water, and it was a matter of life or death. And so they finally track down Elijah, and Ahab's kind of first conversation with Elijah is, hey, listen, this must be your fault. All the fact of us not having any rain, it started when you came in and you told us this, and then you went on your way. What's the deal? And of course, Elijah's like, hey, look, don't blame me. I'm just the messenger. I was just sharing the message of God, and again, just encouraging you that if you just simply turn from your wicked ways, you turn from following these lowercase g gods and surrender your life to the big case G God, listen, things will be different. The rain will return. And you'd think that Ahab, after all this, would be like, okay, you're right, but he's not. Ahab, at this point, and Elijah, they decide to kind of start up this pastor battle. Like they're going to kind of duke it out. Ahab, even though he sees the drought, he recognizes there's no rain, he still kind of questions. He's still struggling to really believe it. And so he's like, you know what? Let's have the prophets of Baal go against you, Elijah. We're going to duke it out. I'll bring up all of our prophets, all of our pastors, and they'll duke it out with you. And of course, they duke it out in a classic guy fashion. They decide to complete this challenge to see who is the real God. Is it Baal or is it God? By having a grill off. Classic guy thing, right? Like a couple guys, we're gonna throw some steaks on the grill and see who wins. And so this is kind of really where we catch up with the story here. So 1 Kings 18, 22, 23, and continuing on here. It says, then Elisha said to them, I am the only one of the Lord's prophets left, but Baal has 450 prophets. Get 2 bulls for us. Let Baal's prophets choose one for themselves, and let them cut it into pieces and put it on the wood, but not set fire to it. I will prepare the other bull and put it on the wood, but not set fire to it. Then you call on the name of your God, and I will call on the name of the Lord, and the God who answers by fire, well, he is God. It continues on, verse 26. It says, so they took the bull given, and then they prepared it. Then they called on the name of Baal from morning till noon. Morning till noon. Baal, answer us, they shouted, but there was no response. No one answered. And they danced around the altar they had made. At noon, Elijah began to taunt them. Shout louder, he said. Surely he is a god. Perhaps he is deep in thought or busy or traveling. Maybe he's sleeping and must be awakened. Man, I think I was born out of season. Talk about the ultimate trash talker there. I mean, man, Elijah got away. He was able to say things that you just can't say nowadays in church. I mean, basically what he's doing there is he's taunting them. I mean, again, this is a basic grill off to determine who's the real God, who's the God to be trusted, and who's the God that can be depended on and is who he says that he is. And so you got the 400 prophets of Baal. They're dancing around, they're shouting, and they're trying to get their God, this Baal, this rain god, to respond. And the more they try and the more they fall flat on their face, here you've got Elijah, and he just starts mocking them, starts trash talking them. Basically, in fact, in the original language, he basically says, hey, maybe your God's busy going to the bathroom. I mean, that's really what he's getting at here in the conversation. It's kind of like as a parent, when you're trying to find those few moments of peace and quiet, you go and you lock yourself and hide yourself in the bathroom. It's kind of what Elijah's alluding to. Hey, maybe he's just hiding out from you guys, trying to get a little bit of a break from all your screaming and yelling. So why don't you just yell louder? Why don't you shout louder? Maybe that'll wake him up. Maybe that'll get his attention, right? And so there's this epic kind of, battle here, this epic trash talking going on, and it continues on. And verse 28-32 says, so they shouted louder and slashed themselves with swords and spears, as was their custom, until their blood flowed. Midday passed. Now midday passed. This is an important chronological note that I'll come back to in a moment. But they continued their frantic prophesying until the time for the evening sacrifice, but there was no response. No one answered. No one paid attention. Then Elijah, after all this time, is like, all right, guys. All right, it's my turn. You've had your fun. You've had your party. You've had your dancing around. Now it's my go at it. And it goes on. It says, then Elijah said to all the people, come here to me. They came to him, and he repaired the altar of the Lord, which had been torn down. Elijah took 12 stones, one for each of the tribes, descended from Jacob, to whom the word of the Lord had come, saying, your name shall be Israel. With the stones, he built an altar in the name of the Lord, and he dug a trench around it large enough to hold 2 seahs of seed. So Elijah, which by the way, this is, I wish I had time to really unpack this, but this is really significant. I mean, that he'd take 12 stones. Again, you got to understand the nation of Israel at the time was divided between 10 tribes and 2 tribes. And so by taking the 12 stones, building this altar with the 12 stones, he was basically saying, listen, hey, God's not seeing any favorites here. Like unity is so important. Like us being together, that's our strength. And this is so important because the enemy, he would love nothing more than to come into a church, come into a family, come into a situation, and try to bring about division. But again, it's so important. And again, I love that picture of him sitting there saying, you know what, I'm not going to buy into that. I'm not going to go that route. You know, we're in this together. And he was 12 stones representative of the 12 tribes and the importance of sort of unity in this. And so it continues on. It says, he arranged the wood, cut the bull into pieces, laid it on the wood. Then he said to them, fill 4 large jars with water and pour it on the offering and on the wood. And then verse 38 says, then the fire of the Lord fell and burned up the sacrifice, the wood, the stones, and the soil, and also licked up the water in the trench. Then all the people saw this. They fell prostrate and cried, the Lord, he is God. The Lord, he is God. All right, a lot of passage there, a lot of scripture there. But kind of start to really unpack this here. Again, we talked about this last week, and sort of the importance of how, and I guess the tendency of when it comes to God doing the miraculous in our lives, making waves in our lives, is that, I don't know if you've noticed this, but God loves to do the impossible, but to do the impossible in our life, he oftentimes calls us to do the impractical first. See, God's impossible, it's always preceded by our impractical. And again, we see this very much so in this story. Because, again, here, you're trying to call down fire. You know, whoever, turns the grill, lights the wick, gets the meat cooking is the winner. And so, so if you're trying to get fire, now, like, I'm not the best camper. Like, there's a reason why I did end up becoming a forest ranger, because I'm terrible at camping. I don't know the first thing of starting and building a fire. I mean, I've got to watch a YouTube video just to get the tent up. But even somebody like me, who's not great in the outdoors, not great at camping, can tell you that probably dousing this barbecue, dousing all this wood, dousing all this rock, dousing this ground with water is probably not the best approach to get fire, right? Like this is, talk about an impractical thing. And yet, as I shared last week, is that oftentimes, listen, it's amazing throughout Scripture, before God does the impossible, how often he'll ask us to do something that at the time seems impractical. At the time seems, unreasonable. At the time doesn't make sense. In fact, you just see story after story of this, actually. I think of just naming stories off the top of my head. I think of Gideon. Here's Gideon, who's forced to take on the Midianites, this army of 132,000, and he's got, about like 30-some thousand. And then, make matters worse, he takes that army to God, and God's like, yeah, that's not going to work for me. Why don't you just tell everyone that doesn't want to fight that they can go home, right? And of course, you're expecting like a Braveheart scene, like, Gideon, we'll never leave you, we'll be there. And they all like run off, and he's left with like 300. It's, and so, again, here's Gideon. In a situation, talk about impractical. You got 300 troops, going against this trained army of 100-some thousand, Midianites. Talk about him being in a place where he's just probably like wetting himself just at the sight of this. Of course, as mentioned before, the wetter, the better, right? And so here he is. He's nervous, he's scared, and of course, we see other stories of sort of, impractical things before God would do the impossible. I think of Joshua. Hey, Joshua, I want you to when it comes to overtaking Jericho, these massive walls, this armed city. Listen, here's what I want you to do. I want you to walk around the city, 7 times and then yell really loudly at the end. Okay, yeah, that's a good idea, God. Let's put a pin on that. Let's, maybe remember that for next time. Great. Any other ideas, right? Again, impractical things, but they would lead to God doing the impossible. And you sit there and you think, well, why? Why do that? Was it to make it harder for God? Going back to the story of Elijah, I mean, that's, again, an incredibly impractical thing. Put water on something you're trying to create fire. But we know that can't be the case. It's not like God sat there and looked at like, oh man, here's this God who, as we read in the story, eventually would their lightning bolt fire down from heaven and incinerate the whole thing. So it's not like he's like looking at this and oh, well, there's a puddle there now. I can't do this. Like, that's too hard for me. It wasn't like I was making it, too hard for him or impossible for him or making it more of a challenge. God's like, let's make this a little bit tougher, this miracle. I really want to show him. But here's the point. I think this is kind of part of the reason why God sometimes will cause us to do impractical things before he does the impossible. And I think it's is that this wasn't about making it tough on God, but it was about making it tough for us to miss God on it. This wasn't about making it tough on God, but making it tough for us to miss God in it. There would have been no... once the fire came and once the fire got going, there would have been no excuse. There would have been no way to sit there and say, well, maybe somebody, sparked a fire that somehow, lit a flame and began this fire. Like, there were no excuses. Like, there was no way this could have happened if God didn't do it. And again, this is important. And this is going to come back to the importance of generosity and specifically the purpose of generosity. But again, before we get to that, though, there's one more question. Like, again, there's that question of why the water, why the impractical that leads to the impossible. But there's another question in the story, and this is really kind of the question that really kind of captured my attention. And that is, where did they get the water? Where did they get the water? Have you ever thought that? Maybe it's just me. I get too much time on my hands, I guess, when I'm looking at this. But, again, you got to remember, this is a drought. They haven't had water in 3 years. And where this is at, Mount Carmel, it was actually considered, it was believed it was actually like the home of Baal, which I think is really cool. Elijah's like, hey, not only am I going to take you on and show you that Yahweh is God Almighty, but listen, I'm going to take you on in your home turf, your home field. I'll give you every advantage you got. And but the truth is, though, Mount Carmel, more than it just being the kind of home of Baal, or considered to be the home of Baal, it was that it was this place was in the middle of nowhere. I mean, it was a long journey to get to any water. I mean, it was just a dust hill. There's not like there's a bunch of lakes or waters or rivers or anything like that around there. I mean, there was nothing there. And then on top of it, you got to look at the chronology of this. I mean, you got to look at the time scale of this. Is again, remember these prophets of Baal, from morning to the evening sacrifice. It says that they were ranting and raving and shouting from morning to evening. Yeah, now get this. When did Elijah start his kind of challenge? When did Elijah, start to light the flame on the grill? Pretty much right at that same time, right at the evening sacrifice. So even if there was water down the hill, even a day's journey, there would not have been enough time for them to get down, to get the water, to bring it back. Now, I think the only way that they could have actually gotten the water to pour on the altar to create this atmosphere, to create this stage for God to do the miraculous, was if this crowd that was around, is if they were willing to give up the water that they brought with them. Because again, to get to where Mount Carmel was, this was going to be like a day's journey for them. So safe to say that each one of them would have carried at least enough water for themselves. And so here you can just imagine Elijah's like, hey man, God's going to do the impossible. God's going to show you the reality of his greatness, the reality that he and he alone is God. But listen, he's calling you to do the impractical. And so listen, to do this, I'm going to need your water. And probably at first they're probably like, I don't know about that. like this is all I got. We're in a drought, this is a matter of life or death. I don't know if I can really surrender this. I don't know if I can give this over to you. And yet here's Elijah, and you just imagine Elijah, incredible guy of faith, just probably like, well, we'll just wait. I'll wait for as long as it takes until we start to get some water to do the impractical thing so God can do the impossible. And so I don't know what kind of transpired in there, but eventually, and just imagine one by one, they're pulling out. One guy's pulling out his Camelback, canteen. Other one's his little, I don't know, kind of yuppie, wooden style, canteen that he got in Portland. I don't know what the deal is, but they're slowly filling up all these jars with water, and then Elijah would take these 12 water pots and he would empty them on the ground once, twice, 3 times until all the ground got soaked. And I love it because it's this great picture. Again, what we're seeing here, what we're beginning to see is really a picture of generosity. What we're seeing here is a picture of how God not just does the impossible, but actually gets and pours his blessing onto our lives. See, God's avenue, God's mode of getting blessing, his blessing into our lives is through the transport of generosity. It's through the transport of giving what we got. Because listen, when you and I have the courage to give what we can, that's when God is able to do what we can't. And that's what we see here. We see this picture of this community, giving what they got. And as a result, God just pouring out his blessing, not just pouring fire, not just showing who he is, but ultimately, eventually pouring down rain, bringing more rain and bringing more water than they knew what they could do with or how they could handle. I mean, it just, this downpour. In fact, it made me kind of think of this story, this old preacher story, of a guy who, around 1930s, he was out walking in the middle of the desert and, came across this old pump. He was out of water, he was desperate, didn't think he was going to make it, but came across one of these old water pumps. I don't know if you've ever seen the water pumps, but the water pumps, back then, it's not like today where you just turn the faucet on and the water comes. Like you got to pump it, but more than pumping it, to get water, like you gotta pour a little bit of water in it to get it going. And in fact, actually, in this story, it actually says that as this traveler, he's making his way and he gets to this pump, that there was actually a note by this pump. And the note said this, says, "I've hidden a canteen under this rock in the shade, cork up, and I've put it in it just enough water to prime the pump. And as long as you drink it first, or as long as you don't drink it first, then it's going to work. Then it's going to get the pump going," right? Talk about a little bit of temptation here. So, I mean, again, here's this traveler. He's got this choice. He can hold on. He can hold on to what he's got in his hands, or he could pour it in the pump. He could trust, in this author of this note, trust in the process of this pump. And by doing that, get more water, all the water that he needs. And again, I love that picture. I love that story, that illustration, because again, that's really what's going on here. Again, so often what this picture is, again, it's a sense of generosity that, listen, when you and I, we give what we can, God will do what we can't. And again, it seems super impractical, but it's generosity that's the mode and the transport of how he gets a blessing into our lives. And again, it doesn't always seem to make a lot of sense to us, and sometimes it can be a little bit frustrating for us. But that's how God really pours out his blessing. But again, it takes an incredibly impractical step to see God's impossible step happen in our lives. But here's where generosity kind of gets really confused for a lot of us. Is a lot of us stop with that. See, I think a lot of us, we actually kind of get that. We get that, okay, yes, if I give, if I give what I can, when it comes to my time, when it comes to, maybe a tithe, and when I say tithe, that 10%, when I obediently give and I surrender that to God, yes, God will bless. God will pour out his blessings. We get caught up in the promise, but a lot of us, we kind of get that. We get the promise of the process, right? But what I think sometimes we get confused is we mistake the promise of the process, his process of getting blessing to us through generosity, as the purpose of the process. See, the promise of the process is that, listen, the well will work. When you give what's in your canteen, he will pour down the blessings of heaven upon you. He will. The promise is that when you trust God, when you trust in the source rather than just your resource, and you really surrender it to God, God is going to provide. My wife and I are, I think, a real testament to that. Ever since we've been married, we've always given. We've always been faithful in terms of tithing to God. And I'm not going to sit there and say that we've always had, just, more than enough, or times where like, just, an abundance of stuff. But listen, we've never gone hungry. We've never gone without. God has always provided for us. The promise of the process has always held true in our life. And listen, anyone here who has walked in generosity, has given and really walked in that practice of giving faithfully, you can recognize that. You understand that. You get the promise of the process. But again, where we get off is when we mistake the promise for the purpose of the process. See, don't mistake this. The promise and the purpose of the process are two very different things. The promise is that, yes, you generosity, when you give what you can, God will do what we can't. But the purpose is so much more than that. The purpose is to actually see God maybe in a way that we've never seen him before. The purpose of God is to actually see God ultimately for who he really is in our lives. In fact, some of you are like, I don't know if I really get this. Well, follow with me here. Malachi chapter 3, verse 10 really speaks to this. In fact, actually sets up a very similar test, kind of like what we see the prophets Baal versus Elijah. This kind of challenge here. It's speaking in terms of tithes and offerings. And we see in Malachi 3:10 it says, bring the whole tithe into the storehouse, and there may be food in my house. Test me in this, says the Lord Almighty, and see if I will not throw open the floodgates of heaven and pour out so much blessing that there will not be room enough to store it. I like that part where it says, see if. See the whole point of this. The whole point of this, and again, this is where it can get really frustrating, is when we just buy into the idea of the process and mistake the promise for the purpose. One of the big things we can mistake is we can fail to see the ultimate goal here, the real purpose of it. And the real purpose is to see God simply for who he is. And listen, you'll never really see God for who he is as our provider, as our source, as the one we can trust in, if you never walk down this path of generosity. You never will. That's the reality. That's what's going on here, is to get you to see. And again, why I say this can be a frustration for a lot of us is because I think sometimes in generosity, especially when we hear about giving, especially when it comes to giving of not just time but money and resources, there can be a lot of guilt kind of involved in it. Some of us, we might even feel a little bit of shame, and some of it, is I think something just kind of poor teaching through the church. Sometimes we kind of have kind of taken this passage and almost kind of taken it out of context, kind of used it to beat people over the head. But you got to understand something. Again, the purpose. The purpose, again, is to see God for who he is. In other words, when it comes to generosity, when it comes to giving, listen, you've got to know God's not looking for us to prove something to him, but that he wants to prove something to us. He's not looking for us to prove something to him, but that he wants to prove something to us. Notice in that verse in Malachi 3, it says, test me in this. Notice he's not saying, hey, test yourself. He's saying, test me in this. This is about me showing and proving to you that I am someone you can trust in. I am the only one you can really rest your life in and cannonball into and rest your security, rest your trust and provision and faith for the future in. Trusting, and not in your resources, but trusting in these sources. See, this is not about you proving something to me. And in fact, I can tell you this is the truth, because when you really look at the context of this passage, so often we fail to sort of read the passages right before this. And Malachi 3:7 speaks to this very thing. It says, I, the Lord, do not change, so you, the descendants of Jacob, are not destroyed. What's he getting at here? He's speaking of something really significant that you got to get. If you're ever going to really walk in generosity, is understanding that when it comes to God's affection for you, when it comes to God's love for you, it's not based on on sort of a pay-to-play thing. He's not looking for you to somehow prove yourself to him. Like if I give enough or give so often that somehow God's love is going to be affected by that. Somehow his heart is going to be affected by that. Truth is, when it comes to his love for you is unconditional. His love for you never changes. Listen, there's nothing you can do to make God love you any more or any less than he does right now. And yeah, while it's true our giving can reveal our heart towards him, it's not reflected in his heart towards us. That's why I say, people will be like, man, do I have to give? No, you don't have to give. When it comes to, God's heart for you, if your motive in giving is in relation to, somehow trying to appease God or somehow win his approval, listen, you don't have to give. In fact, that should never be the motive to give, because your giving has no influence on his heart towards you. His love for you is unconditional. But I've shared this before, though, too, is that when it comes to his blessings, there are some blessings that are conditional. There are some blessings that are conditional. Listen, again, if you want to experience God's blessing in your life, the only way to experience it is through this avenue of generosity. You giving what you can so God can do what you can't. And listen, some of you might get pushback. Well, wait a second, though. What about the next verse? Because this is the verse that we love to sort of guilt people on, and like, man, you got to give. You got to prove your commitment. You got to prove your heart for God. And we see this in sort of the next verse. But again, I think as we're going to come to discover, is sometimes we can tend to kind of take that a little bit out of context. As it says, ever since verse 7 says, ever since the time of your ancestors,